Sir, I'm gonna need you to slowly stand up and keep your hands where I can see them. Holy. Master Chief Thorne?
The engines of Trans-American Airlines Flight 762 wind down. The subtle shift in pitch a signal to the 154 passengers that their journey from San Diego was over. Outside the oval windows, the concrete expanse of Denver International Airport sprawled under a brilliant, cloudless Colorado sky. The usual cabin symphony began. The click of unbuckling seatbelts, the rustle of jackets, the low murmur of conversations as people prepared for the ritual of deplaning. Then, a voice, crisp and unnaturally calm, cut through the noise from the cockpit intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. We will be deplaning shortly, but for now, we need everyone to remain seated. Cabin crew, prepare for arrival." A current of confusion rippled through the aircraft. This wasn't the standard "Welcome to Denver" speech. The flight attendants who had been moving to their stations froze, their professional smiles tightening into masks of uncertainty. The forward cabin door hissed open, but instead of the familiar sight of a gate agent, two figures stepped aboard, their presence immediately sucking the air out of the cabin. They were airport police officers, clad in dark blue uniforms, their hands resting on the butts of their sidearms. Their faces were granite, their eyes scanning the rows with a practiced, methodical intensity that ignored the startled faces staring back at them. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their movements were a language of their own, a silent proclamation that this was no longer a commercial aircraft, but a controlled environment. One officer stayed near the cockpit door, a formidable sentinel, while the other began a slow, deliberate walk down the aisle of the economy cabin. Every head turned, a wave of apprehension following his progress. Passengers exchanged nervous glances, their minds racing through a catalog of worst-case scenarios. Who were they here for? What could have happened? The officer's boots made soft, rhythmic sounds on the carpeted floor. He passed row 20, then 15, his gaze sweeping left and right. The silence in the cabin was now absolute, thick and heavy with unspoken questions. He moved past the emergency exit rows, his expression unchanging, until he reached the curtain separating economy from business class. He pushed it aside and stepped through, his partner following a few paces behind. In seat 8B, a corporate lawyer named Ethan Cole, who had spent the flight reviewing deposition transcripts, lowered his glasses. He had felt a knot of unease tightening in his stomach for the past hour, a feeling he couldn't quite place, but which was now crystallizing into cold certainty. The officers weren't searching. They knew exactly where they were going. Their destination was row 8. The lead officer stopped, his shoulder level with the headrest of seat 8A. He looked down at the man sitting by the window. The man was in his mid-30s, with a powerful, athletic build that even a simple gray crewneck sweatshirt couldn't conceal. His head was bent, his focus entirely on the worn paperback in his hands. He seemed oblivious to the two armed men who had just stopped beside him, his stillness a stark contrast to the electric tension that had seized the rest of the passengers. "Sir," the officer's voice was low, but it carried the unmistakable weight of authority. "I'm going to need you to close your book and put your hands on the headrest in front of you." Slowly, as if surfacing from a great depth, the man in seat 8A looked up. He marked his page with a practiced finger, closed the book, and placed it on the empty seat beside him. There was no surprise in his eyes, no fear. There was only a profound, almost weary calm. He didn't ask why. He didn't protest. He simply looked at the officer, then at the passengers across the aisle whose faces were a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion that spoke of immense self-control, he raised his hands and placed them on the back of the seat in front of him, waiting. The entire aircraft had become a silent theater, and he, for reasons no one could understand, had just been cast as the villain. The man was Master Chief Marcus Thorne, and at 36 years old, he had spent more of his life in service to his country than out of it. 18 years in the United States Navy, 16 of them in the rarefied air of the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, the unit more commonly known to the public by its former name, SEAL Team 6. He was, to put it plainly, one of the most decorated and respected operators in the entire U.S. Special Forces community. His file, locked away in a secure server in Virginia, contained citations for valor that would never be made public, detailing operations in places that officially the United States had never been. 3 Bronze Stars with valor, a Silver Star, and a list of other commendations that took up 2 full pages. He had led teams through dusty, sun-scorched villages in the Hindu Kush and navigated the fetid triple-canopy jungles of Southeast Asia. He had endured SERE school, Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape, a brutal curriculum designed to break the strongest wills, and had emerged with an instructor's commendation. He was a master of controlled violence, yet the defining characteristic of his personality was a deep, abiding quiet. His voice was naturally low and measured, his movements economical, and his gaze steady. In a world of high-octane personalities, Thorne was an anchor, a man whose composure under fire had become the stuff of legend within his command. He wasn't on official business today. He was flying commercial, returning from a training exercise at the Naval Amphibious Base Coronado in San Diego. He was heading to Denver to see his father, a retired Army colonel who was battling a second round of cancer. The trip was personal. He wore civilian clothes, dark jeans, the simple gray sweatshirt, and a pair of worn leather boots. His only luggage was a standard-issue military duffel bag in the overhead compartment, containing a change of clothes, a gift for his dad, and his dress uniform, meticulously folded, its constellation of ribbons a silent testament to his career. Nothing about him was designed to draw attention. He was an expert at blending in, at becoming part of the background. It was a skill as vital to his survival as marksmanship or demolitions. At the boarding gate in San Diego, he had waited until his group was called, presented his ticket, and given the agent a brief, polite nod. He found his seat, stowed his bag, and sat down. He didn't put on headphones or watch a movie. He pulled out a worn, paperback copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, a book he had carried with him on every deployment for the last decade. For the 2-hour flight, he had done nothing but read. He didn't recline his seat. He didn't make any special requests. When the flight attendant came by with the beverage cart, he had simply asked for a water, said thank you, and returned to his book. He was an airline's ideal passenger, self-contained, unobtrusive, and quiet. But it was his quiet that had condemned him. His stillness, his powerful physique, and the color of his skin had been combined in the mind of one person on that aircraft to form a threat. The irony was staggering. Here was a man who had dedicated his entire adult life to protecting the very people who now stared at him with suspicion. A man who had faced down genuine evil in the darkest corners of the world, now being treated as a potential danger because he sat peacefully reading a book on Stoic philosophy. As he placed his hands on the seat in front of him, his training took over. He assessed the situation. 2 officers, 1 primary, 1 support. Cabin full of civilians. No visible threat, only a gross misunderstanding. His heart rate remained steady. His breathing was even. He was in control of the only thing he could be, himself. He knew he had done nothing wrong, and he had faith, perhaps naively, that the truth would eventually surface. He just had to endure the fiction first. Jessica Evans was 34 years old, and in her 9 years with Trans-American Airlines, she had cultivated a specific professional persona. She was crisp, efficient, and immaculately put together, from her perfectly coiffed blonde hair to her polished regulation height heels. To management, she was a model employee, punctual, detail-oriented, with a file free of any major complaints. But among her junior colleagues, she was known for something else, an almost territorial sense of authority. She saw the aircraft cabin not just as a workplace, but as her domain, and the passengers as subjects to be managed. Her ambition was a sharp, hungry thing. She craved the lead flight attendant position on the lucrative international routes, the respect that came with it, and the control it afforded. But that promotion had remained just out of her grasp. Twice she had been passed over for a senior colleague. The rejections had curdled her ambition into a quiet resentment, which she masked with an almost zealous adherence to the rules. She was the first to notice an oversized carry-on, the quickest to correct a passenger who stood up before the seatbelt sign was off. This rigid enforcement of protocol was her way of asserting the authority she felt she was owed. Beneath the polished exterior, however, was a deep well of insecurity. She had grown up in a small, homogeneous town in the Midwest, and her worldview was shaped by a narrow set of experiences. She was uncomfortable with ambiguity, and she often mistook things she didn't understand for things she should fear. A silent, powerfully built black man, sitting alone in business class, was one of those things. From the moment Marcus Thorne had stepped onto the plane, Jessica Evans had been watching him. It wasn't a conscious, malicious decision at first. It was a flicker of something she couldn't name. He moved with a quiet confidence that she found unsettling. He didn't smile effusively at her greeting or try to make small talk. He just gave a polite nod, found his seat, and became utterly self-contained. Her mind, conditioned to see problems, began to invent them. Why was he so quiet? Why wasn't he watching a movie or working on a laptop like the other business travelers? His stillness felt unnatural, predatory. She mentioned her unease to her junior partner on the flight, a young man named Liam, who was only 6 months out of training. "Keep an eye on the guy in 8A, she had murmured as they prepared the galley for takeoff. "Something feels off." Liam, eager to please and intimidated by Jessica's senior status, had simply nodded. He glanced at Thorne, saw a man reading a book, and then looked back at Jessica, trusting her judgment over his own eyes. He saw her as experienced, a professional who could spot trouble he was too green to recognize. He didn't question her. That was his first mistake. Throughout the flight, Jessica's suspicion became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Every one of Thorne's innocuous actions was filtered through her lens of fear. When he turned a page in his book, she saw it as a sharp, sudden movement. When he looked out the window, she saw him scanning the exterior. She was building a case in her mind, brick by brick, out of nothing. The fact that he was a black man wasn't the reason for her suspicion, she would have told herself. It was just a piece of the puzzle, a data point that, in her biased calculus, added to the overall picture of a man who didn't belong. She felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. She was the guardian of this flight, the thin line between order and chaos, and she had identified a threat. Now, all she had to do was prove it. The story of Flight 762's descent into chaos began not at 30,000 feet, but on the ground, in the bright, sun-filled terminal of San Diego International Airport. The boarding process was orderly, typical for a mid-morning departure. Business travelers in suits mingled with families in vacation attire. Marcus Thorne was one of the first to board with Group 2. He stood in line, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder, his posture relaxed but erect. He didn't scroll through his phone or listen to music. He simply observed, a habit ingrained from years of needing to be aware of his surroundings. When he reached the gate agent, a woman named Maria, he handed over his boarding pass. She scanned it. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Thorne," she said with a professional smile. He met her eyes briefly, noted the name on her tag, and replied, "You too, Maria. Have a good day." The small courtesy was genuine, another ingrained habit. Respect the people doing their jobs. It was simple. Maria's smile became a little more real. He walked down the jet bridge at a steady, unhurried pace. Ahead of him, a businessman abruptly stopped to take a call, creating a bottleneck. Thorne didn't sigh or show any impatience. He simply stopped, leaving a respectful distance, and waited. When the man finally moved on, Thorne continued. At the aircraft door, Jessica Evans stood, her smile as bright and hard as the cabin lighting. "Welcome aboard," she said, her eyes flicking over him, taking in his powerful build, his simple clothes, and his race. Thorne gave a slight nod. "Morning." He didn't break stride, moving into the cabin to find his seat. The brief, unremarkable interaction was, for Jessica, the starting point. Her internal alarm system, already primed by her biases, had tripped. He didn't fit her mental image of a business-class passenger. Most were white or Asian, dressed in blazers or expensive casual wear. Thorne, in his plain sweatshirt and jeans, carrying a military-style duffel, looked out of place to her. She watched as he efficiently stowed his bag in the overhead compartment, the movement fluid and strong. He settled into his window seat, 8A, and immediately became still, a portrait of calm. From her position in the forward galley, Jessica turned to the tablet that held the passenger manifest. She scrolled to seat 8A. Thorne, Marcus. The name meant nothing to her. She looked back at him. He had pulled a book from a pocket in his sweatshirt and opened it. He wasn't looking around. He wasn't fidgeting. He was just sitting there. But for Jessica, his lack of typical passenger behavior was, in itself, a deviation from the norm. It was suspicious. Ethan Cole, the lawyer who would later be seated in 8B, boarded a few minutes after Thorne. He was flustered, having nearly missed the flight. He nodded a hurried thanks to Jessica, shoved his briefcase under the seat in front of him, and immediately began sorting through a stack of papers. He barely registered the man sitting by the window. To him, Thorne was just a silent seatmate, a background figure in his busy day. He couldn't have known that he was about to get a front-row seat to the complete unraveling of a man's rights, orchestrated by the very person tasked with ensuring his safety and comfort. And it would all begin with a simple piece of paper. The last of the passengers had boarded, the overhead bins were closed, and the cabin door was sealed. As the aircraft began its pushback from the gate, Jessica Evans commenced her final compliance check. She walked down the aisle, her eyes scanning for unfastened seatbelts and upright seatbacks. It was a routine part of her job, but today she was using it for a different purpose. She had a target. She moved through the small business class cabin, offering polite reminders where needed. When she reached row 8, she paused. She looked at Ethan Cole, who was still absorbed in his legal documents, his seatbelt securely fastened. Then she turned her full attention to Marcus Thorne. He was sitting as he had been for the last 15 minutes, his book open in his lap, his seatbelt on. He was in full compliance. This, however, did not fit Jessica's emerging narrative. She needed a reason to engage, to test him, to assert her authority. She manufactured one. "Sir," she said, her voice a little too loud in the quiet cabin. Thorne looked up from his book. "I'm sorry, I'll need to see your boarding pass again." The request was highly unusual. Boarding passes were checked at the gate, and sometimes by the flight attendant at the aircraft door upon entry. To ask for one after the passenger was seated and the plane was moving was almost unheard of, unless there was a clear seating dispute, which there wasn't. The seat next to Thorne was empty. Thorne didn't question her. He didn't argue or ask why. He simply reached into his back pocket, pulled out the boarding pass he'd tucked away, and handed it to her. His movements were calm and deliberate. There was no flicker of annoyance in his expression. Jessica took the pass and studied it as if it were a complex legal document. Thorne, M, seat 8A. She looked from the paper to the seat number above his head, then back to him. "Okay," she said, handing it back. The single word was clipped, devoid of the courtesy one would expect. It was an acknowledgement, not an apology for the interruption. Across the aisle, Ethan Cole had looked up. As a lawyer, he was trained to notice deviations from procedure, to analyze human interactions for subtext. This interaction was saturated with it. The flight attendant's tone was accusatory, her request irregular. The passenger's response, on the other hand, was a model of stoicism. He saw a man being singled out for no apparent reason, and a flight attendant who seemed to be looking for trouble. A small red flag went up in his legal mind. He made a mental note of the time and the nature of the encounter, a habit from years of documenting everything, and then tried to return to his work, the seed of concern now planted. Jessica walked back to the galley, a sense of vindication coursing through her. In her mind, Thorne's calm compliance wasn't a sign of a disciplined man being polite. It was the calculated stillness of someone who was trying not to be discovered. He had passed her first test, but for her, the trial was far from over. She felt she had confirmed her initial suspicion. This man required watching. The interaction had been her first move in a chess game only she was playing, and she was already planning her next one. Once the plane reached its cruising altitude of 32,000 feet, the familiar routine of cabin service began. Jessica Evans and her junior partner Liam started at the front of the business class cabin with the beverage cart. The atmosphere was relaxed. The low hum of the engines was a constant backdrop to the soft clinking of ice in glasses and the quiet murmur of passenger requests. Jessica was in her element. She moved with a practiced grace, her smile perfectly calibrated. "Mr. Henderson, another gin and tonic for you?" she'd ask the frequent flyer in 2A. "Ma'am, can I offer you some champagne this morning?" she'd say to the woman in 3C. Each interaction was a small performance of attentiveness and hospitality. As the cart rolled down the aisle, Ethan Cole ordered a black coffee, his eyes still glued to his documents. The cart was now parallel with row 8. Jessica leaned over Ethan to hand him his coffee, her body language creating a deliberate barrier towards the other side of the aisle. She smiled at him. "Let me know if you need anything else at all." Then she straightened up, gave the cart a small push, and moved on to row 9. She had not looked at Marcus Thorne. She had not spoken to him. She had not offered him a drink. It was as if seat 8A was an empty void. The omission was so deliberate, so glaring, it was louder than any insult. It was a public declaration. "You are not welcome here. You are invisible to me." Thorne, who had momentarily looked up from his book as the cart approached, registered the slight. His face remained impassive. He had experienced far worse. In training, he had been deprived of food, water, and sleep for days on end. A skipped beverage service on a 2-hour flight was a minor annoyance, an act of petty disrespect he could easily ignore. He lowered his eyes and returned to his reading, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. He would not press the call button. He would not make a scene. He would simply endure. But Ethan Cole saw everything. He had lowered his papers just enough to watch the entire non-interaction. He saw the flight attendant serve him, then physically turn away from the man in 8A and move on. It wasn't an accident. It couldn't have been. They were less than 3 feet apart. It was a conscious, targeted act of exclusion. The red flag in his mind was now waving furiously. This wasn't just poor service. It was something uglier. He looked across the aisle at Thorne, expecting to see anger or at least frustration. He saw nothing but a man calmly reading a book. The contrast was jarring. The sheer discipline of the passenger in the face of such blatant disrespect was almost as remarkable as the disrespect itself. Ethan took a sip of his coffee. The taste was bitter. He knew he was now a witness. He didn't know to what exactly, but he knew the pattern. An irregular document check followed by a public snub. He began to subtly watch the flight attendant, Jessica, as she continued her service, her professional smile never faltering. She was playing a dangerous game, using the veneer of her uniform and the rules of her job as both a sword and a shield. And Ethan had a sinking feeling that it was not going to end well. In the forward galley, shielded from the passenger's view by a thin curtain, Jessica Evans was cementing her narrative. Liam was arranging snacks in the service bins, trying to stay busy and out of her way. "Did you see him?" Jessica said, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "See who?" Liam asked, not looking up. 8A. He didn't even react. I skipped him with the cart and he just stared back down at his book, like he's waiting for something. Liam stopped what he was doing and finally looked at her. He had seen the skipped service. It had made him uncomfortable, but he had chalked it up to Jessica being busy or perhaps having a momentary lapse. Now he realized it was intentional. "What do you mean, waiting for something?" he asked, a hint of confusion in his voice. "It's not normal, Liam," she insisted, her eyes wide with a conviction that bordered on paranoia. "Normal passengers would complain. They'd hit the call button, they'd get angry. He's just sitting there, perfectly still. It's unsettling. It's like that calm before the storm thing. He's too controlled. It's erratic behavior." The word erratic hung in the air between them. It was a serious charge, a term used in aviation security to describe passengers who posed a potential threat. To Liam, the passenger's behavior seemed the exact opposite of erratic. He seemed disciplined, maybe even tired. But Jessica was his senior, the one with 9 years of experience. Her certainty was persuasive, and his own desire to avoid conflict was strong. He didn't challenge her bizarre logic. That calmness was a sign of aggression. That stillness was erratic. He just gave a weak, non-committal shrug and went back to his snacks. His silence was all the affirmation Jessica needed. She now felt she had a co-conspirator, a witness to the threat she was perceiving. She was no longer just a suspicious flight attendant. She was the leader of a security-conscious crew. Back in seat 8A, Marcus Thorne was not waiting.
He was enduring.
His SEAL training had hammered into him the doctrine of emotional control. Reaction is a choice. Outrage is a luxury. In a hostile environment, and this cabin was rapidly becoming one, the person who controls their emotions controls the situation. He knew he was being provoked. The boarding pass incident, the skipped beverage service, these were tests, attempts to get a rise out of him. To react with anger would be to give the provoker exactly what she wanted, a justification for her prejudice. It would make him the angry black man, validating her fear and escalating the situation. So he chose to do nothing. He chose to read his book and regulate his breathing, retreating to a place of inner calm that no flight attendant could touch. But what Thorne perceived as a strategy for de-escalation, Jessica Evans, through her twisted lens, saw as a confirmation of danger. His discipline looked like conspiracy. His patience looked like plotting. Every moment that passed, every page he turned, she grew more convinced that she was not just serving a flight, but protecting it from a silent, coiled threat that only she was perceptive enough to see. She was a hero in her own mind, and she was dangerously close to acting like one. About an hour and a half into the flight, as the aircraft began its initial descent preparations for Denver, Marcus Thorne decided he needed to retrieve a charging cable from his duffel bag. His phone battery was low, and he wanted to make sure it was fully charged to call his father as soon as they landed. He unbuckled his seatbelt, stood up in the spacious business class aisle, and turned to the overhead bin. The movement was simple, economical, and lasted no more than 15 seconds. He opened the bin, reached inside his bag, located the small cable, and closed the bin with a soft click. He then sat back down and buckled his seatbelt. It was an action performed by dozens of passengers on every single flight in the world. But Jessica Evans, who had been watching him from the galley, saw something entirely different. She saw a sudden, powerful movement. She saw the man accessing his bag for an unknown object. She saw him standing in the aisle, his broad back and muscular frame seeming, in her heightened state of anxiety, to dominate the cabin. This was it. This was the overt act she had been waiting for. She turned to Liam, her face pale, her voice tight with adrenaline. "He's up. He was in his bag. That's it. I'm calling the captain." "Jessica, wait," Liam finally said, a flicker of protest in his voice. "He just got a cable. I saw it." "You don't know what else is in that bag," she hissed, cutting him off. "We're on descent. No one should be getting up like that. It's a threatening posture." She was past the point of reason. Her fear and her desire to be right had merged into a single, unstoppable impulse. She picked up the interphone, her hand trembling slightly, and pressed the button for the cockpit. When Captain Davies answered, his voice calm and professional, Jessica unleashed the narrative she had been constructing for the entire flight. She did not say, "A man got something from his bag." She used the specific trigger-laden language she knew would elicit a swift and serious response. "Captain," she said, her voice a carefully modulated performance of urgent concern. "This is Jessica in the main cabin. I have a situation in business class with the passenger in 8A. He has been exhibiting erratic and unsettling behavior throughout the flight. He's been non-compliant and just displayed a very aggressive posture, getting into the overhead bins during initial descent. I am concerned for the safety of the crew and passengers. I have a bad feeling. I feel threatened." She had used the magic words: erratic, aggressive, threatened, safety of the crew. In the post-9/11 world of aviation, those words left a captain with zero room for interpretation. Captain Davies, sealed in the cockpit, had not seen any of the events. He had no visual on Thorn. His entire understanding of the situation was based on the report from his senior flight attendant, a 9-year veteran he was trained to trust. Federal aviation protocol was clear. A crew member's credible threat assessment must be acted upon. He had no choice. "Understood, Jessica," the captain's voice came back, now tinged with a new gravity. "Secure the cabin, I'll make the call." The call. The one that sets in motion a chain of events that cannot be easily stopped. The call to air traffic control, which would be relayed to airport operations, which would be relayed to law enforcement. The call that requests police meet the aircraft upon arrival. Jessica hung up the phone, her heart pounding. She had done it. She had taken action. She glanced through the curtain at Thorn, who was now quietly plugging the cable into his phone and a portable battery pack. He looked completely harmless. But in Jessica's mind, she had just averted a catastrophe. She had protected her flight. She had done her job. In reality, she had just signed a man's name to a federal report built on a foundation of lies, and in doing so, had sealed her own fate. The wheels of Flight 762 touched down on the runway at Denver International with a gentle bump. For most passengers, it was a routine end to a routine flight. But as the plane decelerated and began its long taxi toward the terminal, the sense that something was wrong became palpable. The flight attendants were not performing their usual cheerful post-landing duties. Jessica and Liam stood stiffly in the galley, their faces grim. Then Captain Davies' voice came over the intercom again, and this time, all traces of airline warmth were gone. "Ladies and gentlemen, for your safety and security, it is imperative that everyone remain in your seats. I repeat, do not stand up, do not open the overhead bins, and do not use your mobile phones. Remain seated until you are given further instruction by the authorities." The word authorities hung in the air, instantly confirming everyone's fears. The cabin, which had been buzzing with the low hum of imminent deplaning, fell utterly silent. People stared at each other, their expressions a mix of fear and confusion. A collective anxiety thick as a blanket settled over the aircraft. This wasn't a customs check or a medical issue. This was something else. The plane came to a final stop at the gate, but the jet bridge did not immediately connect. Through the windows, passengers could see the flashing blue and red lights of 2 airport police cruisers parked on the tarmac below, their presence a stark and ominous signal. The minutes stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. The silence was absolute. Ethan Cole, in seat 8B, felt a cold dread creep up his spine. He knew, with the certainty of a lawyer who has seen how quickly things can go wrong, what was about to happen. He glanced across the aisle at Marcus Thorn. The man was staring out the window, his posture unchanged. He was either a man of superhuman calm or completely unaware of the storm that was about to break over his head. Finally, the jet bridge docked with a heavy thud. The forward cabin door was opened. The 2 police officers from the tarmac stepped on board, their faces set and serious. They were followed by their supervisor, a sergeant with silver hair and a weary expression. The trap was now set. The sergeant conferred quietly with Jessica Evans at the front of the plane. She pointed a trembling finger down the aisle. "Row 8, seat A." Her voice was a strained whisper, but in the tomb-like silence of the cabin, it was audible to the first few rows. The 2 officers, with the sergeant behind them, began their walk down the aisle. Their progress was slow, deliberate, each step amplifying the crushing tension. Every passenger was now a spectator in a real-life drama, their gazes fixed on the officers and their unseen target. The entire aircraft, a metal tube filled with 154 souls, had been transformed into a pressure cooker, a silent, mobile interrogation room. And at its center was a man who had done nothing more than sit quietly. A man who was about to have his world turned upside down in front of a captive audience. The steel trap, built of fear and prejudice, had been sprung. The lead officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s named Miller, stopped directly beside Marcus Thorne's seat. His partner, Officer Chen, took up a flanking position one row behind, his hand resting near his sidearm. The choreography was standard procedure for confronting a potentially dangerous individual on an aircraft. "Sir," Officer Miller began, his voice firm but not aggressive. "My name is Officer Miller with the Denver Airport Police. I'm going to need you to slowly stand up and keep your hands where I can see them." Marcus Thorne looked up, not at Officer Miller's face, but at the small American flag pin on his uniform and the service ribbons just below it. He saw the combat infantryman badge. He recognized a fellow veteran. Slowly, he placed his book on the seat, unbuckled his seatbelt, and stood up. He moved with a fluid grace that was anything but threatening. He stood to his full height, his hands held open at his sides, his gaze calm and direct. It was in that moment, as Thorne stood fully illuminated by the cabin lights, that the entire situation fractured. Officer Miller's eyes, which had been narrowed with tactical focus, suddenly widened. A flicker of disbelief, then dawning recognition washed over his face. His professional mask dissolved. "Holy!" Miller breathed, his voice dropping from a command to a whisper. "Master Chief Thorne?" The question was so unexpected, so utterly out of place, that it short-circuited the entire tense standoff. Officer Chen looked at his partner in confusion. The passengers in the surrounding rows stared, baffled. Thorne gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "It's just Marcus now, officer. I'm on leave." Officer Miller, a 20-year Army veteran who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, had never met Thorne personally, but he knew exactly who he was. He had attended joint service briefings where Thorne's name was spoken with a kind of reverence. He had seen the classified after-action reports that were used as training materials, detailing missions led by a SEAL Master Chief whose tactical brilliance and legendary composure under fire were the gold standard. He was looking at a living legend of the special operations community. The accusation from the flight attendant, erratic, aggressive, threatening, collided with the reality of the man standing before him and shattered into a million pieces. The threat was one of the most trusted and disciplined soldiers in the entire United States military. Miller's entire posture changed. He took a half step back, a subconscious gesture of respect and apology. He raised his hand slightly as if to halt the proceedings. "Sir, Marcus, there's been a report, a threat assessment from the cabin crew." He said the words as if they tasted like ash in his mouth. He looked from Thorne's calm face to the pale, anxious face of Jessica Evans, who was watching from the galley, her confident facade beginning to crumble. "I understand," Thorne said, his voice even. "I've been reading my book." The simplicity of the statement was devastating. It laid bare the absurdity of the situation. The intended arrest, the culmination of Jessica's manufactured narrative, had collapsed into a moment of profound, embarrassing error. Officer Miller knew with absolute certainty that he was not looking at a suspect. He was looking at the victim. He turned his head slightly toward the sergeant who stood behind him. "Sarge," he said, his voice low but clear, "we have a massive problem here." The unraveling had begun, and it was happening faster and more publicly than anyone could have ever imagined. The sergeant, a man named Peterson with 25 years on the force, stepped forward, his eyes assessing the scene. He saw the deference in Officer Miller's posture. He saw the unwavering calm of the passenger, and he saw the dawning horror on the flight attendant's face. He understood instantly that the situation had been grossly misrepresented. The power dynamic on the aircraft flipped in a heartbeat. "What's going on, Miller?" Sergeant Peterson asked, his voice low. "Sarge, this is Master Chief Petty Officer Marcus Thorne," Miller replied, the formal title a clear indicator of his respect. "He's DEVGRU, a national hero, not a threat." A low murmur rippled through the nearby rows as the passengers who overheard the exchange began to process the new information. The man they had been led to believe was a danger was, in fact, a highly decorated Special Forces operator. The looks of suspicion that had been directed at Thorne now swiveled, like turrets, toward Jessica Evans. Her face, which had been a mask of righteous concern, was now chalk white. She looked trapped, exposed under the harsh glare of the cabin lights and the sudden, intense scrutiny of 100 pairs of eyes. Just then, Ethan Cole, the lawyer in 8B, unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. "Sergeant," he said, his voice clear and confident, cutting through the confusion. "My name is Ethan Cole. I'm an attorney, and I've been sitting right here for the entire flight. This man," he gestured to Thorne, "has done absolutely nothing wrong. In fact, he has been subjected to a pattern of targeted harassment and unprofessional conduct by that flight attendant since the moment we pushed back from the gate." He spoke with the precision of a man presenting an opening statement. "I witnessed her demand to see his boarding pass for no reason after we were already seated. I witnessed her deliberately skip him during beverage service. I have been watching her watch him for this entire flight. Whatever she told you is a fabrication. I will provide a formal, sworn statement to that effect to whoever needs it." His intervention was a bombshell. It provided instant, credible corroboration for what the officers were just beginning to suspect. Liam, the junior flight attendant who had been standing silently behind Jessica, looked as if he was about to be sick. He avoided everyone's gaze, staring intently at his own shoes. Sergeant Peterson nodded at Ethan. "Thank you, sir. We'll be taking you up on that." He then turned his attention back to Thorne. "Master Chief, on behalf of the Denver Airport Police, I sincerely apologize. We were responding to a report from the airline. Would you be willing to come with us to the terminal so we can get a clear picture of what happened here?" It was a request, not a command. Thorne was no longer being treated as a suspect. "Of course, Sergeant," Thorne replied, his voice still betraying no emotion. He reached down to pick up his book and tucked it into his back pocket. As the officers escorted Thorne, not as a prisoner but as a protected witness, toward the front of the plane, a passenger in row 10 raised her phone and began recording. The video would capture the scene perfectly: the decorated SEAL, calm and dignified, the apologetic police officers, and in the background, the flight attendant, Jessica Evans, leaning against the galley wall, her face a mask of disbelief, as her career and her carefully constructed reality imploded in front of 150 silent witnesses. The deplaning of Flight 762 was an awkward, silent affair. Passengers filed off, stealing glances at Jessica Evans, who was instructed to remain on board, her face ashen. Once the last passenger was gone, the aircraft officially became a crime scene, or, more accurately, the scene of a federal incident. The jurisdiction immediately shifted from the local airport police to the FBI and the Transportation Security Administration, TSA, who had been alerted the moment a police meet aircraft call involved a potential security threat. Two stern-faced FBI agents and a senior TSA field officer boarded the plane. Sergeant Peterson and Officer Miller briefed them quickly, explaining the initial report and the dramatic turn of events. Jessica Evans and Liam were immediately separated and escorted off the plane to different interview rooms in the terminal's secure area. Master Chief Marcus Thorne was taken to a quiet office reserved for airline operations managers. He was not treated like a suspect. He was offered a bottle of water, which he accepted, and a chair, which he took. The senior FBI agent, a man named Wallace, sat across from him, not with a notepad, but with a palpable air of respect and deep concern. "Master Chief Thorne," Wallace began, "I cannot apologize enough for what you've just been through. Our job now is to get a full and accurate account of what happened on that flight. Please, just walk me through it from your perspective, from the moment you boarded." Thorne, true to his training, delivered a debrief, not a complaint. His account was precise, clinical, and devoid of emotional embellishment. He detailed the boarding process, the polite exchange with the gate agent, the boarding pass recheck, the skipped beverage service, and the simple act of retrieving a cable from his bag. He reported the facts as he had observed them, using the dispassionate language of an after-action report. He presented the sequence of events without interpretation, leaving the conclusions to the investigators. His credibility was absolute. Agent Wallace listened, his expression growing more grim with every detail. Meanwhile, in a sterile, windowless room 2 floors below, Jessica Evans's story was crumbling. Her interview was conducted by the second FBI agent and the TSA officer. Initially, she stuck to her script, her voice trembling with manufactured fear. "He was just so intense," she claimed. "His stillness was aggressive. He was scanning the cabin, watching me. When he stood up during descent, I genuinely feared for my safety. I followed my training." The agent pressed for specifics. "What exactly did he say to you that was threatening?" "He didn't say anything," she admitted. "That's what was so scary." "Describe specifically how he was scanning the cabin." "He would look up from his book, just for a second. It was a look." "What kind of look?" "A threatening look." Her explanations were circular, subjective, and fell apart under the slightest scrutiny. She couldn't name a single concrete action, a single threatening word, or a single violation of regulation on Thorne's part. Her entire case rested on her feelings, her intuition, and the vibe she got. Faced with the calm, methodical questioning of federal investigators, her narrative, which had seemed so compelling in her own mind, now sounded flimsy, irrational, and deeply prejudiced. When the agent asked why she had skipped him during beverage service, she stammered, I must have just missed him. I was focused on the potential threat." The lie was so transparent it was pathetic. The investigation had barely begun, but the truth was already painfully clear. In the modern age of air travel, an aircraft is a vessel of surveillance. Every critical angle of the cabin on Flight 762 was monitored by high-definition CCTV cameras, their footage stored on a secure hard drive. Within an hour of the incident, Trans-American Airlines' corporate security team, under direct order from the FBI, had downloaded the complete video record of the flight. It was sent to Agent Wallace's team at the airport. They watched it on a large monitor in the operations center. The footage was silent, but it spoke with unimpeachable clarity. It was the complete and total refutation of Jessica Evans's story. First, they watched the boarding. The camera positioned over the forward galley captured Marcus Thorne's entry. It showed him give a brief, polite nod to Jessica and proceed to his seat. There was no confrontation, no tension. Next, they spooled to the moment of the boarding pass check. The camera angle from the front of the cabin was clear. It showed Jessica approach Thorne, who was seated and reading. It showed him hand over the pass without any argument. It showed her hand it back. The entire interaction was calm and lasted less than 30 seconds. Then came the beverage service. The footage was damning. The camera followed the cart as it moved down the aisle. It showed Jessica serving the man in 8B, Ethan Cole. It then showed her physically turning her body away from Thorne's side of the aisle as she moved the cart to the next row. It was not an oversight. It was a deliberate, calculated snub, captured in pristine digital detail. Finally, they watched the event that triggered the call to the cockpit. The camera showed Thorne stand up, open the overhead bin, retrieve a small object, close the bin, and immediately sit back down. The entire sequence took 14 seconds. At no point did he make a threatening posture. He did not linger in the aisle. He did not interact with anyone. Less than a minute later, the same camera captured Jessica Evans in the galley, picking up the interphone. But the most compelling evidence came from an unexpected source. The passenger in row 10, who had started recording after the police boarded, had emailed her video to the tip line the FBI had established. Her footage captured the audio the CCTV lacked. It clearly recorded Ethan Cole's powerful statement. "This man has done absolutely nothing wrong. I witnessed her deliberately skip him during beverage service." It was a perfect match to the visual evidence. The video evidence was absolute. It transformed the case from a he said, she said into an open and shut case of a flight attendant fabricating a security threat. Agent Wallace watched the footage a second time, his jaw tight. Jessica Evans hadn't just made a mistake in judgment. She hadn't just overreacted. She had systematically harassed a passenger and then lied to the captain and federal authorities, setting in motion a dangerous and costly security response. She had weaponized her uniform and the fear of terrorism to act on a personal prejudice. and she had done it all on camera. The news of the incident on Flight 762 traveled up the corporate ladder at Trans-American Airlines at the speed of light. Before Marcus Thorne had even finished his statement, the airline's VP of Flight Operations in Dallas was on a secure call with the head of corporate security. The Pentagon had been notified by the FBI, a standard protocol when a senior active duty service member is involved in a federal incident. The Department of Defense's response was swift and glacial. An official inquiry was launched, and a spokesperson issued a terse public statement about a deeply troubling incident involving a decorated U.S. Navy service member. The pressure on the airline was immense and immediate. This was not a customer service complaint that could be handled with a voucher and an apology. This was a federal case involving racial profiling, false reporting, and the unlawful detention of a national hero. The potential for a catastrophic public relations disaster and crippling legal liability was obvious to everyone in the executive suite. Trans-American's internal investigation moved with brutal efficiency. They had the witness statements, the FBI's preliminary report, and the devastating CCTV footage. There was no ambiguity. Jessica Evans was suspended before she even left the airport interview room. 2 days later, after a perfunctory meeting with HR and the airline's legal counsel, she was terminated. The official letter cited the reasons with cold corporate precision. Gross misconduct, including the filing of a false security report against a passenger, violation of federal aviation regulations, and discriminatory behavior unbecoming of a Trans-American Airlines employee. Her 9-year career was over. Her security credentials were revoked, her access to company systems was cut, and a box of her personal belongings from her locker was couriered to her apartment. Liam, the junior flight attendant, was placed on indefinite leave pending a full review. During his interview, he tearfully admitted that he knew Jessica's concerns were unfounded, but was too intimidated and inexperienced to challenge his senior partner. "I just didn't want to cause trouble," he repeated. "I should have said something." His failure to intervene was a black mark on his record. 3 weeks later, facing a lengthy disciplinary process he knew he couldn't win, he quietly resigned. The cascade didn't stop there. The internal audit dug deeper. It was discovered that 2 prior complaints had been filed against Jessica Evans over the past 3 years. Both came from black male passengers, one citing unwarranted scrutiny, and the other describing her tone as condescending and hostile. Both complaints had been classified as minor customer service disputes by an HR manager and closed with no action taken. That manager was demoted and reassigned. The airline's entire in-flight crew training program was put under review, with a new mandatory module on racial bias and de-escalation immediately fast-tracked for development. Captain Davies, who had made the call based on Jessica's report, was cleared of any wrongdoing by the FAA, as he had followed protocol. However, the incident served as a stark cautionary tale for every pilot in the company about the critical importance of questioning and verifying crew reports whenever possible. The consequences were cascading through the system, a direct result of one woman's prejudice and the corporate culture that had failed to check it sooner. 2 weeks after the incident, Master Chief Marcus Thorne, with the full backing of the Department of Defense, retained the services of one of the top civil rights law firms in the country. The lawsuit was filed in federal court. It named Trans-American Airlines and Jessica Evans individually as defendants. The complaint was a masterwork of legal precision, alleging racial discrimination, false imprisonment, defamation, and the intentional infliction of emotional distress. The lawsuit sought not just compensation but systemic change. Attached to the initial filing was a mountain of irrefutable evidence. The complete time-stamped CCTV footage, the cell phone video from the passenger in row 10, complete with audio of Ethan Cole's testimony, sworn affidavits from Cole and 2 other business-class passengers, and the airline's own internal records detailing the 2 prior unaddressed complaints against Evans. The legal team at Trans-American Airlines knew they were facing a battle they could not win. A jury would see what they saw: a decorated American hero, a man of color, being calmly and systematically harassed by a white flight attendant who then lied to federal authorities. There was no defense. Taking the case to trial would be a public relations bloodbath, a drawn-out spectacle of damning testimony and viral video clips that would cost the airline hundreds of millions in market value and brand reputation. They moved to settle, and they moved quickly. The negotiations were not about guilt or innocence. That had already been established by the evidence. They were about the price of accountability. Thorne's lawyers were unyielding. This wasn't just about money, it was about ensuring this could never happen again. After 3 weeks of intense back and forth, the airline capitulated. The settlement was one of the largest of its kind in aviation history: $8.2 million. The figure was broken down with specific purpose: $4.5 million in compensatory damages to Thorne for the harm done to his reputation, his false imprisonment, and the severe emotional distress of the event. A further $3.7 million in punitive damages, a massive financial penalty designed to punish Trans-American for its gross negligence and to deter future misconduct. A significant portion of the punitive damages was assessed against Jessica Evans personally, a judgment that would follow her for the rest of her life. But the non-financial terms of the settlement were, in Thorne's view, even more important. The airline was legally bound to 1. Overhaul its crew training program, working with civil rights experts to create a new, mandatory curriculum on implicit bias, conflict de-escalation, and the legal ramifications of false reporting. 2. Establish an independent civilian complaint review board with the power to investigate and override internal HR decisions regarding discrimination claims. 3. Issue a formal public apology to Master Chief Thorne and the U.S. Armed Forces, explicitly acknowledging the racial bias that led to the incident. 4. Upgrade the CCTV systems across their entire fleet to include audio recording capabilities in the galley and boarding areas. The airline paid the price. They agreed to every term. The check was cut, and the reforms were set in motion. Accountability, they learned, came with a very specific and very high number attached. For Marcus Thorne, however, the victory was not in the dollar amount. It was in the forced acknowledgement of the truth and the systemic changes that might protect someone else from having to endure the same ordeal. The following Monday, Master Chief Marcus Thorne reported for duty at his command in Virginia Beach. He wore his uniform, his posture as straight and disciplined as ever. He walked into his commanding officer's office for a formal debrief. The officer, a Navy captain who had known Thorne for a decade, didn't ask him to recount the events. He had already read the full, classified report from the FBI and the DOD. He looked Thorne in the eye and said something that meant more to him than any settlement. "Marcus, you were provoked, you were slandered, and you were unlawfully detained. Through it all, you conducted yourself with the honor and unshakable discipline that defines what a Master Chief in the United States Navy is. You faced down ugliness without losing yourself. Your command and your country are proud of you." Thorne simply nodded once. "Thank you, Captain." That was all that needed to be said. He did not go on a press tour. He declined every interview request from major news networks and morning shows. He had no interest in becoming a cable news celebrity or a symbol. He was a SEAL, and SEALs operated in the quiet. He let the facts of the case, the CCTV footage, and the landmark settlement speak for themselves. The record was the truth. Quietly, without any public announcement, he took a substantial portion of his settlement and worked with his lawyers to establish a non-profit foundation. Its mission was simple: to provide free legal resources and advocacy for active duty service members and veterans who become victims of racial discrimination. The foundation was named the Aegis Fund, after the protective shield of the Greek gods. He never attached his own name to it. The work was the reward, not the recognition. 6 months later, Thorne was on another flight, this time from Norfolk to a training facility in Florida. He was flying on Trans-American Airlines. He had deliberately booked the ticket. He walked down the jet bridge, his duffel over his shoulder, and stepped onto the plane. A young flight attendant with a warm, genuine smile greeted him at the door. "Welcome aboard, Master Chief," she said, having recognized the name on the manifest and perhaps having seen the now famous training video. "Can I get you anything before we take off? A bottle of water?" Thorne paused, a faint, rare smile touching his lips. "I'm good, thank you, but I appreciate you asking." He found his seat, stowed his bag, and sat down. He pulled out his worn copy of Meditations. He was just another passenger, and this time, that's all he was. In a training center in Dallas, a new class of Trans-American flight attendants sat in a darkened auditorium. On the giant screen at the front of the room was a still frame from the CCTV of Flight 762. It showed a black man in a gray sweatshirt standing calmly as two police officers looked on in confusion. Below the image, a single line of text appeared. "This cost us $8.2 million. His dignity should have cost us nothing." It's easy to paint Jessica Evans as a monster, a simple villain in a story of right and wrong. But the more unsettling truth is that her actions likely didn't spring from a place of active, malicious hatred. They grew from a more common and perhaps more dangerous seed, a profound insecurity that she allowed to fester into prejudice. In her world, authority was her shield against her own feelings of inadequacy. She saw her uniform not as a symbol of service, but as one of power. Marcus Thorne, a man who possessed a quiet, unshakable self-assurance that she could never understand, became an unwitting threat to her fragile sense of control. His calm wasn't peace, it was a challenge to her authority. His race was simply the hook on which she hung her pre-existing fears. Her failure wasn't a single bad decision in the air, it was 1,000 small failures of empathy and self-awareness on the ground that led her to that irreversible moment. We can ask, what if Thorne had reacted differently? What if, when provoked, he had raised his voice in righteous anger? The tragic irony is that it would have only validated Jessica's fiction. He would have been labeled the angry black man, the very stereotype he was trying to defy. His assailants would have felt justified, and the truth would have been muddied. His greatest weapon in the end was not his strength, but his discipline. He understood that in a battle of prejudice, the first casualty is often the reaction of the oppressed. By controlling himself, he controlled the narrative. It's a terrible burden to bear, the responsibility to be perfect in the face of imperfection, but it was the one he chose. This story is a stark reminder that the systems we build, the corporate protocols, the security procedures, are only as good as the people who wield them. Without empathy, without the constant, difficult work of questioning our own biases, these systems can be twisted into weapons. They can become tools not of safety, but of discrimination. Thorne's victory was not just his own, it was a painful lesson, bought at a high price, teaching an entire corporation that the cost of prejudice is always, eventually, paid in full. This story resonated deeply with us. What part of Master Chief Thorne's journey stood out to you the most? Have you ever witnessed a quiet moment of injustice and wondered what you would do? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and please support the channel so we can continue to bring these important stories to light.